Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, September 8th. And my name is Heather. I'm coming to you from Toronto, and I am very excited to see you all. I missed you so much last week. I'm never completely happy on a Friday if we don't have Talking Data Equity. So welcome back if this is your second or third or maybe 60th time joining us, and welcome if this is your very first time joining us. Talking Data Equity is something that the We All Count team does most Fridays, not every single Friday, but most Fridays, as a place where anybody from any sector and any country who is working on increasing the equity in their data project can come together for an informal chat where we can learn from each other about practical, concrete tools, techniques, and ideas that help us improve the equity in our data projects. And Talking Data Equity is different every single Friday. Some Fridays, you have just me, and I'm talking to you about a project or a case study or something technical, like, how to collect respondent driven survey data or something. And then lots of times we have special guests. And today we do have a special guest who I'm going to introduce you to in just a second. We have Lauren Young from the Beloved community. And they're here to share some great stuff with us. But before I introduce Lauren, let me just do a really quick review of the logistics, because we have a lot of people that come together on a Zoom meeting. So in order for that to work, what we do is we ask that you remain on mute for the first part of Talking Data Equity. And while our special guest is sharing her stories and sharing her slides, we ask that you remain on mute and that you put lots of questions and lots of comments and have all the conversations you want to have in the Zoom chat. And when you use the Zoom chat, you can do so two ways. You can set that drop-down menu to everyone, which means everybody who's here will see your comment or question. Or if you want to ask a question privately, you can just direct message me, Heather Kraus. Once our special guest is finished sharing their stories and their presentation that they prepared for us, that's when, if you have a question or have something you want to share, that's when you can raise your hand and we'll unmute people one at a time in the room, and you can share, by talking rather than putting it into Zoom. All right. So thank you so much for welcoming our special guest today, who I'm very, very excited about. Our special guest is Lauren Young. And Lauren is the director of data and analysis for a very, very cool organization called Beloved. And you can find them at wearebeloved.org. And Lauren's coming to us from St. Louis, Missouri, like a few of our other favorite special guests. And Lauren's a data strategist who has a lot of experience in the nonprofit sector and working with data, working with technology, and developing organizational culture with a focus on equity, a focus on accountability and innovation. She has a master's degree in public admin and a bachelor's degree in political science and institutional studies from St. Louis University. So that is enough talking from me. And I am going to warmly welcome Lauren and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's not every day that you listen to those facts about yourself. So I really appreciate the tee up. That is better than I could have described this afternoon, my experience and sort of how I'm coming to you all. But I think the most important thing that you said there is being a data strategist. I'm not a statistician, which possibly lots of you are. What wakes me up in the morning to do this work, my passion is really data on purpose. So really making meaning of data to advance on equity. If we're not even willing to ask the difficult questions and interrogate our own practices, then we're not going to be able to really get to equity for all. So I'm really excited to be here, and we'll we'll talk today about our organization, who we are, what we do, and importantly, how we do it. So just a quick second here. As Heather mentioned, I'm the Senior Director of Data and Analysis at Beloved Community. Beloved Community is a racial and economic nonprofit consulting firm. We are based in New Orleans, although I'm coming from St. Louis. And we also do research and policy advocacy at the core of what we do. So I'm really excited to be here with you all to talk about the ways that we think about data equity in our work at Beloved Community. First, I'll share a little bit about who we are, about the work that we do, and how it's changing the ways that we learn, the ways that we live, the ways that we work in regions across the country. So first and foremost, Beloved Community is a people-centered organization. We believe that we can't talk about what we do until we talk about who we do it alongside. We're a team of 24 human beings in 11 cities, connected to one another in Dr. King's vision for the Beloved Community. Dr. King defined the Beloved Community as a global vision in which all people can share the wealth of the earth. A world where racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. We believe that in order to bring about this beloved community, we first need to build sustainable change. We do so at Beloved Community by supporting regions to further their collaborative journey for racial and economic equity, and by centering our most marginalized communities as we advance towards that beloved community. We say regional because we believe that we really have to be pulling levers across all sectors within a region in order to actually get to economic equity. So as we get started, if you feel like being in community today, feel free to drop in your name, the organization you're with, and a personal value that informs how you approach that work. We usually start with a warm welcome at Beloved to engage us in community before we get going. That's a strategy that we use to build culture and community. So feel free to engage if you'd like to reflect on one personal value that informs your approach to the work that you do. So when we talk about what we do, we always start with sustainable change because we know that building equitable communities where racial and economic equity exist is generational work. So as we dismantle systems that are designed to oppress, we must build new systems in their place. We have to create solutions that outlast changes in leadership, legislation, funding, and even public support. And to know that we're creating sustainable change requires equitable data, because we have to know the difference between thinking, feeling, and hoping that diversity, equity, and inclusion exist in the work that we do and in our communities, to actually knowing or having evidence that that is occurring. So how do we build sustainable change? We build sustainable change at Beloved Community by turning commitment into action. So we turn commitment into action by empowering teams within organizations to drive change through equity audits and through thought partnership. It also looks like guiding leaders through capacity building sessions and equity work plans. We'll talk about what those are in a little bit. We also curate custom frameworks for operationalizing equity commitments and then measuring that operationalizing. Our approach is universal, and it achieves measurable systemic change in housing, the workforce, and education. Those are the three pillars of our work. We create that change through our mutual accountability framework. So we believe that sustainable change must occur at the individual, the organizational, and the systemic level. So as critical as these outcomes of our work are, the way that we work is of equal importance to us, because we recognize that the ways in which we work can oftentimes perpetuate the harmful practices and systems that we're trying to dismantle. So we're committed at Beloved Community to disrupting the ways in which we work. Those ways are deeply ingrained in us in capitalist society and deeply ingrained in white supremacy culture norms. We want to instead lead and build from somewhere different. We're inspired by Audre Lorde's words, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." That somewhere different that we lead and build from begins with our core values. So our core values inform everything we do and how we do it, including our data practices and the tools that we have developed to engage other organizations in their data practices. So we believe that people change systems. People are the greatest unit of change. When people embrace shared values, they maintain systems that amplify those values. Every one of us has an obligation to make personally relevant change. And when leaders change, they accelerate systemic change for the organizations that they lead. We know that the default systems in the United States are designed to segregate. And we believe that by questioning and challenging the default, we can dismantle that and we can build equitable systems in its place. And that's really why we're all here today and why I'm starting with our values, because we believe, all of us, that something different is possible in the way that data is collected, managed, analyzed, and used in our society, regardless of what sector or industry we represent. Every day, Beloved Community honors and centers our Black communities. What we talk about in our work is not just academic jargon or hot topics to think about and discuss. The topics of race, systems of oppression, and marginalization have real life and death consequences for our Black communities. We say centering Black lives because we believe that the root of white supremacy is anti-Blackness specifically. And we believe in our work that it's crucial to continuously interrogate and address the ways that biases, racism, white supremacy, and intersectionality impact our decisions and the ways that our organizations operate. We also deeply believe that there's enough for everyone. It's our duty to make space, to co-create, and to imagine abundant possibilities in ourselves and in our communities. It's our time to build just futures, and to do so by creating from a place of abundance. We also believe that joy must be a part of the revolution. We insert levity where appropriate throughout all of our work, and we still maintain our commitment to justice to those communities who have experienced the most harm. And finally, all of the systems that we currently experience were built with someone's biased perspective. We don't believe that any system, process, or law is neutral. We consistently ask, who were these policies and practices designed to benefit, and who were they designed to marginalize? Interrogating neutrality is at the core of how we continuously push ourselves in our work to establish and reevaluate again and again if our data systems and practices that we have created in this work are perpetuating marginalization or disrupting it. So in addition to our core values that I just named, we're further grounded in our work at Beloved Community through several foundational theories. So as many of you likely know, intersectionality is a framework developed in the 1980s by Kimberly Crenshaw to address the double oppression that women of color, particularly Black women, experience. The framework is the study of overlapping or intersecting social identities and their related systems of oppression, domination, and discrimination. Intersectionality suggests that various biological, social, and cultural categories, such as gender, race, class, ability, sexual orientation, religion, age, nationality, and many other spectrums of identity, interact on multiple and often simultaneous levels. Intersectionality deeply informs our data collection categories at Beloved Community, how we are willing to disaggregate data, and when we really have to bring folks along to understand that sometimes a disaggregation that a client wants or a partner wants in the work is really not as simple as the categories that we're accustomed to using based on popular databases like the census. Even when disaggregating across too many categories could potentially compromise individual identities of folks with intersecting marginalized identities. So in our data collection and reporting, that's one of the ways that interrogating neutrality is grounded in intersectionality. Most critical race theory, also known as CRT scholarship, attempts to demonstrate not only how racism continues to be a pervasive component throughout dominant society, but also why this persistent racism problematically denies individuals many of the constitutional freedoms they were otherwise promised in the United States. CRT states that racism is endemic to US society. At Beloved Community, we are one of very few nonprofit organizations in the US to hold our own IRB. For those who may not be as familiar, IRB stands for Institutional Research Board, and it's a federal seal of approval that allows an organization to conduct human subjects research. IRBs are almost exclusively owned by universities and large institutions. Having an IRB allows us to be bold and inclusive in our quantitative and qualitative research while still centering the voices of marginalized communities in research and data and designs. And it also allows us to include voices in our research and as researchers who would otherwise be excluded from conducting that research in their own communities because of the nature of universities. We also draw on broad research on belongingness to help stakeholders understand the impact of personal action and experience of individuals in organizations across demographics and identities. In our work, we triangulate belongingness data with other organizational data, such as engagement and retention data, and that centers the impact of belongingness and its connection to the desired outcomes. Many times organizations are tempted to look at belongingness data and outcomes data, like graduation rates for students or staff retention rates. But we triangulate the data so that we can help center the experiences and help folks understand how the experiences of marginalized individuals and their sense of belongingness actually impacts what they hope to achieve. Once we understand the profound impact of belonging, then we guide stakeholders and administrators through the concept of habitus. Habitus is a class-based analysis of behaviors and habits. If belongingness explains the human need for acceptance, habitus explains how and why people experience belonging and self-exclusion based on socioeconomic status. It doesn't represent fixed states of being, but it takes into account capitalized multi-generational practices and how those impact current choices and aspirations. We use the framework of habitus to help communities identify the practices that resonate most with the diverse socioeconomic populations that they serve. Habitus theory in our work, and especially in our data practices, informs our use of participatory action research and emphasis on community-centered qualitative data collection, as well as how we design practices and systems that include shared voice and shared power. And we believe that that is all equally as valuable data, if not more valuable, than a lot of quantitative data. Organizing theory comes into play for us because we believe that sustainable change develops from investing everyone in an organizational community and outside an organizational community in the vision and in creating real expectations for everyone to carry parts of the work. We embed organizing practices and coach new community or youth organizers in schools so that they develop the internal capacity to organize. We actually host a youth participatory action research summer academy. And during the academy, youth who seek change in their schools or in their communities learn the why and the how behind the role that equitable quantitative and qualitative data plays in organizing and then in advocating for sustainable change. We also draw from organizational change management theories to develop and train stakeholders on key tools that help them process, identify, and commit to change. Sustainable culture shifts requires change at every level of an organization, and we have developed equity tools, which we'll go through in just a minute, that are grounded in data to engage all stakeholder groups in advancing equity. And finally, culture, history, and political economic theories situate the examination of culture within context. This set of frames challenges static depictions of people and the activities in which people are engaged. Instead, it examines processes and the manner in which inequities emerge as part of a much longer historical arc. Political and cultural and historical theories also recognize that culture must always be examined within context. Individuals and communities are shaped by larger institutions and policies, and these institutions and policies are continuously contested as people exercise their own agency. We believe that building this deep context of culture, history, and politics requires a deep data analysis. So building deep data analysis and creating profiles of regions and organizations and communities within regions, that deep analysis to build the context that we need is one way that we avoid perpetuating harm when we set out to do our work. So we leverage data to understand the folks that we're working with before we even get started on the work. So these beliefs and foundational theories led to the development of the tools that I have mentioned. The Equity Tool Suite is a series of tools that we have designed to support organizations and individuals on their equity journey. This is a screen grab of the structure of our very first tool that we ever created years ago, the Equity Audit. So the Equity Audit is actually a free online tool that aids organizations of all types in assessing their institutional practices and policies that lead to diverse, equitable, and inclusive communities. This tool explores hundreds of indicators that assess the current state of an organization or an institution's stakeholders, community partners, board members, employment and hiring practices, and more. And it asks organizations to consider not only the practices and policies, but the associated data that you have in place associated with these indicators of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, the Equity Audit is a free online tool that anyone could use, could explore to think about how this might work for your organization. The Equity Lens Map is the individual self-assessment for equity leadership capacity that we've designed. And it measures domains such as self-awareness, understanding interpersonal and institutional bias, interrupting that bias and discrimination when it occurs, allyship, fatigue, and internalized oppression. The Equity Lens Map is typically paired with the Equity Audit, and it's used by all staff within an organization. When the Equity Lens Map data is produced, organizational leaders can really gain an understanding of their team's ability to lead for equity change and what unique supports might be necessary for individuals with marginalized identity in organizations. So for example, an organizational leader might see that their staff across the board has really high self-awareness. They may see that one subgroup, like white males in their staff, have lower interruption of bias scores, and they may see that Black women have higher fatigue scores. This is a dynamic that we see often, and we coach organizations on how to leverage that data to build equity leadership capacity and improve belonging, retention, and other outcomes. The Equity Work Plan is a 3-year roadmap for equity change within an organization, and it's built based on the data that is collected through the 2 assessments, as well as focus groups, equity interviews, and even community-based surveys. The organization-based tools emphasize data as an essential element in bringing about sustainable change. The ways in which we define diversity, equity, and inclusion at Beloved Community require organizations to be really reflective about their organizational context, community, and regional nuance. And that, of course, includes some data reflection. So for diversity, we ask, to what extent does any population reflect our regional demographics. So diversity is about representation in our work at Beloved Community. For equity, we ask, to what extent are the outcomes from any particular program that we offer predictable by participants' demographics? And for inclusion, we ask, to what extent do our diverse populations feel comfortable, respected, and powerful within our organization? And to what extent are diverse community perspectives included in decision-making that affects their lives? You can see that the substandards within each of these framing questions shape the data collection in our tools and really encourage a deeper level of examination and data practices within organizations. So for diversity, organizations will ask themselves, to what extent is a diverse population of groups aware that our organization exists? To what extent does a diverse population of groups apply? To what extent do we select a diverse and representative group in? And to what extent then does a diverse and representative group self-select in once they've been selected by us? So diversity for us and the data and the practices around it are a lot more complex than strictly representation. Getting to a representative diversity really requires these different levels of interrogation and data practices to really make that diversity sustainable. For equity, we ask, to what extent an organization has established internal audit procedures for your various functions. Do you know that diversity, equity, and inclusion exist? Or again, do you think or hope so? Are we assuming some things, right? We also ask, to what extent an individual's demographics or identities predict both their assignment or entry point within an organization and their advancement, how they move through and get to certain outcomes or success within your organization. To what extent do you invest or distribute equitable financial resources across demographics or identities? And finally, to what extent are the actual performance outcomes, when you think about what success looks like for any member of your organization, any individual within, what does that success look like? And are we measuring and interrogating to really ensure that we have the data to know that that success is not predictable by someone's demographics or identities? And finally, for inclusion, we ask, to what extent members of your organization use inclusive language in every medium of communication. Language is one where organizations often need support, understanding how to build a data practice to understand that, because language feels intangible to us. We also ask, to what extent every individual, regardless of demographics or identities, have shared voice and shared power, self-report a high sense of belonging within the organization, and to what extent individuals have access to culturally relevant celebrations and culturally relevant communications. So taking a look at a few examples of organizations that have made real changes in their work based on their results and data from the tools, we'll start with diversity. So we had several businesses in our Equity at Work cohort in New Orleans that focused on hospitality organizations. Several businesses actually began tracking where their job postings were listed and whether or not their postings were reaching a diverse range of applicants. Oftentimes we have go-tos, right? It's time to post a job. We go to the places where we think we're going to have a really wide reach, but these organizations actually started interrogating whether or not that wide reach was reaching the individuals that they needed to reach in order to get to a diverse applicant pool and thereby be able to select a diverse applicant pool. We also had an educational advocacy organization that we were working with engage in similar practices around that representative awareness, application, and selection of their key partners. This educational advocacy organization reported that they're now able to identify which voices are missing from their work, and they can provide more concrete and clear recruitment and engagement goals to those who are leading this work within their organization. So in any advocacy-focused organization, lots of times the individuals engaging in the advocacy are not the individuals benefiting from the advocacy. And so for this organization, beyond their staff, it was critical that the voices that were informing and actually engaging in the advocacy were representative. And then in an example of equity, we had an organization really interrogate more deeply, going from assignment to advancement. So we had a corporate client mention that they have started after this process to codify their data practices around advancement pathways for their employees. So a lot of times we think of diversity as just the set of people within an organization. But equity then is how individuals are equally able or equitably able to achieve success within the organization. So this corporate client began tracking when conversations about advancement were happening with their employees, and they began to routinely assess in formal and informal ways whether or not employees were actually aware of the opportunities to advance and move up in their career at the organization. So organizations who engage in the equity tool suite that we just talked about also find that after that, they're really in need of further support in developing equitable data practices as they work towards implementing that change. So it's really tempting to jump straight to the data practices, thinking, how can we collect this? But we believe that equitable and inclusive data practices really requires intentionality. And from my point of view, there's 3 initial steps that anyone can take to get started on building an inclusive and equitable data strategy. So the first thing I would say to do is to consider your values and your grounding theories, as we've talked about with Beloved Community. If these are not clear at an organizational level, or there's no emphasis at the organizational level on equitable data practices, which we hear a lot, you can start with yourself. We know that data cannot just be one person in a room with a data set. Almost all of us have some element of data that we use or could be using in our roles. So you can truly start with yourself and you can ask, what do I believe in? Where did these beliefs come from? This is the way that we interrogate neutrality here in the process. Second, I encourage making a why sandwich. It's lunchtime for lots of us, so if you're not eating yet, I apologize for mentioning sandwiches. But really, always asking why before you collect data and before analysis, even if your analysis was planned. Circumstances in our world and in our workplaces change all of the time, every day. Being really crystal clear about your motivations for collecting data and designing analyses and reports really provide an opportunity for each of us to check for the ways in which data could be an undue burden for marginalized communities and the ways that data can be misused or weaponized. It really allows us, making this why sandwich, it really allows us more than one opportunity to really adjust our plans to mitigate harm. Additionally, it allows us to check for the ways that white supremacy culture shows up in our plans, which oftentimes we experience and interrogate on our own data and research teams, that the norms that come into play in data plans are a false sense of urgency, an either or mindset, right? Either this is true or it's not. That's the way data makes us feel sometimes. And that's the way we're often inclined to think about the value of data. Also, more, bigger, better. Right? That's why the emphasis on quantitative a lot. And we believe that that is something that needs to be interrogated and shows up often, and individualism and so on. And finally, to get started on creating an equitable data strategy for yourself or your organization, you can create a data philosophy that allows you to really pressure test the answer to that why. A data philosophy is a defined general approach or a set of ethics through which you develop and continuously refine your data practices. Folks interested in designing more equitable data practices often ask us, well, what's in your data philosophy? So we thought we would share ours with you today. So our data philosophy at Beloved Community is comprised of what we believe and what we commit to. So we know that inequity, systems of oppression, racial injustice exist. We're here because we need to create sustainable changes for the people most impacted by these issues in our society. It's critical that our data philosophy reflects diversity, equity, and inclusion, all the way from collection to implementation. So our data philosophy is in consistent refinement. People, including ourselves, are always learning and changing in response to how inequity, systems of oppression, and racial justice show up in modern society. It's continuously informed by research in regards to the voices and lives of experiences of individuals with historical and currently marginalized identities. We believe that data is not neutral. This data philosophy was actually created by our entire team in a collaborative process at Beloved Community. We believe that data is not neutral. We believe that data practices exist within our mutual accountability framework. So we're all accountable to creating equitable and inclusive practices. It's not just one person or a data team. We believe that data is only as reflective as the collection allows. It's only as representative as the collection allows. And we believe that data collection must be informed by the life experiences of its participants. At Beloved, in our data philosophy, we commit to interrogating neutrality in all data research and evaluation practices. We commit to utilizing data to advance our mission while consistently striving to operate outside of the characteristics of white supremacy culture. We commit to inclusive, accessible, and transparent data practices, to never weaponizing data, and to examining the identity of the researchers and practitioners whose work we uplift in our resources and citations. So it's not just what we do, but who are we drawing from in our work? Whose work are we leaning on? Where did this data come from? When we cite past studies, right? Was this actually conducted equitably? And these things do require a rejection of urgency because it takes time to do this equitably and inclusively. And finally, in our data philosophy at Beloved Community, it was important to us to include a note on how we grow our data practices in a way that is intentionally aligned with our beliefs. Because when we're called in, as we have been before, we want to maintain that same intentionality and that same rejection of urgency in responding, so as not to perpetuate harm for our team, right? And we recognize that we must act with a diligence in order to understand the harm that was created when we're called in and to mitigate that harm in as timely a manner as we can. So our approach to data is constantly evolving. When there's any disjuncture with an aspect of our tools, our content, or our core services we provide, historical knowledge of our work, we pause, invite, and converse as a unit. So rather than respond to calls for change with urgency and fear, we instead replace that urgency and fear with intention and care. And we do that as well externally. So we believe that transparency in this process when we're called in our work is an essential part of maintaining our core values in how we grow our practice. So to conclude, so that we can get to some Q&A time if folks have questions, a few ways that you could leave here today and be a change agent in your own work for equitable and inclusive data practices. So first, you could develop your organization, your team, or your individual data philosophy by asking yourself two questions. What do I believe should be true about data practices in order to center marginalized identities? And what do I commit to? It doesn't have to be a hard process. You can really just get a pen and paper out and think about the answers to those two questions and develop a philosophy for yourself if you're doing this on an individual level for your work. Second, you can reflect on your data strategy if you have one already. So are my or our data practices aligned with our core values? Does my or do our data design process include the why sandwich? Are we doing this? Where can you add that in? And then lastly, you can visit awabybeloved.com to actually access that forever free equity audit and to learn more about our tools, our services, and we are have an upcoming certification process for our equity tools as well. That is opening next week, I believe. And then I'm sure, Heather, you will put this in the community forum, but I do have my email here in case folks would like to reach me.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was awesome. And you're so generous to include your personal email. I'm quite sure you'll be hearing from a number of folks. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share so thoughtfully and completely the approach that your team takes to data and the way that you choose as a team and a collective to kind of navigate the fairly predictable problematic waters that is data and knowledge and evidence. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share that with us today. And I know that there's lots of appreciation in the chat, so I'll just amplify that and let you know that lots and lots of people in the chat are also sharing their appreciation. So before I turn to some questions in the chat, I want to give folks who are in the room an opportunity to raise their hands and ask a question, share an experience, share a reflection on the ideas and tools that Lauren's been sharing. Is there anyone in the room? And if you want to unmute yourself, what we ask is that you raise your hand. And the way that most Zoom setups allow you to raise your hand is you click on something that says reactions, which is usually a little smiley face with a plus on its head. And if you click on that, one of the things will say raise hand, and that allows you to raise your hand. But if you don't have that, you can just put it in the chat that you want to raise your hand. Or also you can unmute yourself. Great. Hi, Rachel. Go ahead.
Hey, Lauren, thanks so much for the presentation. I really appreciate it and learned a lot. I'm curious, in my work, I've seen more of a move towards asking questions of belonging, especially in kind of like these large survey formats where we would typically ask like also about demographics and like other elements of like diversity. So I was just curious if you had like any kind of like best practices or like thoughts to think about like when you're asking questions about belonging, especially, you know, maybe in these like really impersonal kind of like large scale population surveys where there may not be an opportunity to build trust with all of the participants. Yeah, just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, going through, so first of all, depending on the sector of the organization we're working with, we recommend different tools for belonging. We don't often write those climate surveys ourselves or belongingness surveys ourselves. So we recommend different tools that are really nuanced and already validated on belongingness for the different sectors. So for example, one that comes up and is useful across all organization types is the Q12 survey that Gallup actually has produced. And then in schools, oftentimes we recommend Panorama. If you're attempting to incorporate belonging questions to existing surveys or broader surveys that you have, like you mentioned, one thing that I have learned through our validation process in our equity lens map is to not outrightly ask the thing that we can easily be influenced on, right? We can trick ourselves. So instead of, do you feel a sense of belongingness at your organization, looking at the elements of belongingness and asking about those questions. So for example, do you have a best friend in the workplace? Do you believe that your work is valuable? And do you believe that you are trusted? Things like that. So asking, incorporating questions into existing surveys about what leads to belongingness is one recommendation that I would have.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That is such a good question. Interrogating what constitutes belongingness is something that I I know from direct experience that quite a large number of people that come to Talking Data Equity are trying to figure out. So I really appreciate your insights, and Rachel, for you raising that, because it's so crucial. We may do a whole session on that.
If there
Um,
are any K-12 schools here, we also have a public good that we have launched that I could send you, Heather, and you could add to the community forum, a public good that is another self-assessment. So it's a new tool, and we're probing it to go deeper into belongingness. That is specifically for adults and children. There's two different ones in K-12 schools.
That's fantastic. Yeah, please do send us that information and we'll put it in the forum. Because I know that there's several groups of people who are here who are working on one for a new racial equity centered tool to measure sense of belonging in post-secondary colleges and universities and other types of learning environments. So that's a nice synergy. Awesome. Anyone else that's in the room want to raise their hand and ask a question? And there is plenty of time. While we're waiting, I'm going to go through a couple of questions that are in the chat. And some of the questions are to everyone will see them because they've been asked kind of publicly. And then a number of them get direct message to me. And one of the recurring themes is an immediate pickup on your talk, Lauren, about a rejection of urgency. So the question is essentially, do you have any practical advice that we can use when we are embedded in organizations that are urgency oriented, I think is the nice way to say it.
Sorry, I was responding to Dora in the chat. Could you ask me one more time?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. No worries. People are looking for practical advice on even communicating about why they want to move away from recreating the urgency. So anything you have about how we can talk to our colleagues or bosses or funders about why urgency is problematic, and anything practical you might suggest about simply being able in an employment situation to say no to urgency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's tricky. I mean, I think it definitely depends. The best argument would depend on the context and the individual that you're trying to influence. I think that if we're talking about the pressure to demonstrate urgency around outcomes, of course, we don't want to let ourselves off the hook. And we point our funders who ask questions of us back to the fact that this is generational work, right? We cannot simply and should not simply produce metrics of success to satisfy a need for urgency that you have just for the sake of satisfying it. Where is that desire for urgency coming from is the place that we go to. Sometimes in a funder dynamic, it can come from a desire to feel good about the investments that they're making, right? And so I think that trying to understand where someone's sense of urgency is coming from in any case is probably where I would start to say how you can influence and push back against that urgency. So I think trying to understand why someone feels a sense of urgency and finding a way to pose to articulate the consequences of that urgency and the impracticality oftentimes of that urgency, and then possibly proposing a different solution, right? I can't produce the outcomes that you would like to see for your board meeting because our data is not there yet. And I will be producing something that doesn't really feel good about a set of outcomes for me. But instead, what I can do is tell a story to the board about what we've learned so far. And so proposing alternatives for people can sometimes help them see, I can think about this differently.
That is extremely helpful. I really like those practical ideas of developing an illustration of why urgency is actually going to be counterproductive to the stated goal
Yeah.
and suggest something else.
Yeah.
Great suggestions. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Okay, I think we have time for about one more question before we say goodbye for this week. Does anybody in the room want to raise their hand and unmute? Dennis has some great suggestions in the chat. I love that suggestion. Yeah. Including the context is crucial. I will now look through the questions in the chat and see what is being asked by a couple of people to use for our last question. And I think probably there are a lot of questions and enthusiasm, as you've already seen, Lauren, in the chat about the IRB. We've talked a number of times at different sessions of talking data equity about IRBs and the pros and cons and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about your IRB? IRB again means Institutional Review Board, and how it came to be.
Yeah. So our Senior Director of Research and Impact is Dr. Faith Karras. We work side by side in leading our Data Research Impact and Policy team, DRIP, as we call ourselves. And so when Faith joined us at Beloved in the fall of 2020, she was very clear that in order to really disrupt systems of oppression in research and to actually fully engage communities that we serve in research instead of doing research on people, which is a systemic and historical oppression, that the gateway to that unlocking that door and our ability to be bold is through an IRB, so that we are not beholden to any other organization's standards, particularly organizations with a lot of red tape, in order to be able to conduct research and demonstrate that the model that we have developed and that our theory of change will actually be the change that we seek towards economic equity and racial equity. So that IRB was acquired. It was a lengthy process. We have an advisory board, and I think we have our first team member who actually had her own project that she wanted to do research, who went through our IRB and our advisory board and got that approved. And then we do look to the future to engage key partners in external organizations who seek to do research. We look to explore the ways that might be possible through our IRB.
That is fantastic news, and congratulations. I know that that's a gigantic amount of work, and from where I sit, it really is a game changer. It really is one of those practical steps to disrupt and quite active systems of oppression and marginalization in the generation of knowledge, if we're going to call it that. So thank you so much for sharing about that, and also for doing that work. That's so cool.
It is awesome.
Yeah. Okay. We need to leave it here because we always try and not end at the top of the hour so that everybody has a little bit of space. But huge thank you, Lauren. This has really been a fabulous conversation. So many resources shared already. My inbox is full of requests for follow-ups. Let me share with everyone in the chat the specific link where within the community forum where we will share this video and all of the associated links and resources, because we know you want them. I really appreciate it. And we are back next week, same time, same Zoom link. And take really good care of yourselves and of each other. Thank you for spending time with us, Lauren.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Heather. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.